While we understand that filling them with expensive free agents might not be in the blueprint for the Cardinals offseason, what are some of St. Louis's biggest needs to fill this winter? What's going on, everyone, and welcome into this edition of b-schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer with you on Friday, November 22nd, 2024, talking some offseason needs for the St. Louis Cardinals in today's episode, as we've kind of spent a lot of time discussing the fact that the Cardinals aren't going to be super aggressive in spending a lot of money this offseason, trying to fill the holes on their roster to make the team better than what we just saw in 2024. A lot of these solutions are maybe going to come internally, but we do want to take a look at some of the needs the Cardinals might have and maybe some of the ways in which they could go about trying to fill those needs. There's a recent article for foxsports.com that I noticed from one of their staff writers, Deesha Thosar, I believe is her name, covers baseball for Fox Sports, and listed some of the biggest needs for a few NL Central teams. Really, all 5 NL Central teams, I think, were featured in her article. So we'll go through what she had to say about the Cardinals and where we agree, disagree, and maybe where we find the manner in which the Cardinals might try to go about filling some of these needs and whether we expect them to do very much at all in regard to some of these categories. So we'll get into that. Quick note for everybody that by the time you're listening to this podcast, you may be ready to hear about some of the non-tender news that the Cardinals are going to drop at any point this afternoon on Friday, where the non-tender deadline is just a couple of hours away as I record this. There will be folks on the 40-man roster who the Cardinals may decide to non-tender, which means they did not tender them a contract offer, and those players will become free agents. I don't know any information about that as of this recording, so that will come, and the reaction to that will come in a later episode. But some names to maybe keep an eye on: Zach Thompson, what do the Cardinals do with him? Luken Baker is somebody that we've certainly talked about. And then some of the relievers, guys who may have options, but the Cardinals may decide they don't want to give a 40-man roster spot to or a major league contract to as they tender out these offers. So keep an eye on Ryan Ludus, Kyle Leahy. I assume that somebody like Chris Roycroft, Riley O'Brien, those guys probably stick around, and I think even maybe still have some options. I know Riley does. But as the Cardinals begin to plot out the rest of their offseason, this does tend to be a day that features some movement, that features some transactions. I don't have a great handle for exactly where the Cardinals might look to go. They might decide to drop a number of guys off the 40-man later today, or they might decide to kind of keep everything tidied up and trust that the names that they are offering these contracts to are guys they either want on the big league roster, and that would apply to guys who don't have options, or they're guys that have options that they say you're on the 40-man. You do make more money as part of the 40-man roster, even if you're not on the 26-man roster. But it's somewhat negligible in the grand scheme. But maybe not, in the current status of where the Cardinals organization is on payroll stuff. So we'll see. They also have to think about roster spots too. If they do want to add anybody, maybe via trade where they're taking on multiple additional names, or perhaps free agency, they're still going to be looking to mine waivers and things like that, possibly. And look, folks are going to drop off of 40-man rosters today, and therefore those guys could be eligible and could be intriguing to the Cardinals to pick up, because the Cardinals are sort of going to be looking for diamonds in the rough and maybe just, average league production in the rough, and that could apply to some of the names that are dropped off from other teams on Friday. So keep that in mind. That'll be a topic that we talk about in an upcoming episode. But for today, let's talk a little bit about offseason needs. And again, we'll refer to the article for foxsports.com from Deesha Thosar and talk about what she sees for the Cardinals and whether we kind of align with that. Number one was starting pitching. I don't think that's really a surprise to people who have seen the offseason transactions so far, with Lance Lynn and Kyle Gibson going to free agency after their one-year deals. And then, of course, you have Miles Mikolas and Steven Matz floating around, guys who the Cardinals owe money to for this upcoming season. But what is the internal viewpoint on the production the Cardinals are expecting from those guys? In terms of, do you just plug them right back into your starting rotation and hope for the best? Or do those end up as spots that the Cardinals either need to fill internally with other folks or need to go out and scavenge in free agency or the trade market to find some answers for? And it's definitely a standing question what the Cardinals' proclivity will be toward actually venturing out and acquiring outside talent to fill any holes. But they've got a number of forks in the road that they could choose to take. And I think when it comes to Mikolas and Matz, I feel like they're both going to still be here unless there's an avenue where Steven Matz has enough value to somebody where they'll pay him a few $1,000,000. The Cardinals might eat half or more of the remaining, $11 million or so on the contract for this year. Yeah, you could go that route. But if you're the Cardinals and you're letting Lance Lynn walk and you're letting Kyle Gibson walk, even if you're retaining Sonny Gray and even if you're not planning to float Eric Fedde in the trade market, he's going to make $7.5 million for the upcoming season and then will be a free agent. So you kind of figure, okay, if the Cardinals aren't in it at the deadline, maybe Fedde ends up being a trade chip that you take and move, kind of like they could do with Ryan Helsley if they don't trade him in the offseason. It's going to depend on where the Cardinals are at come July. But if you're coming into the season with Fedde in a spot and Sonny Gray in a spot, and we talk about the young guys that we anticipate to get opportunities in that rotation, like Pallante, I think he should pretty well be locked into a spot to begin the year. And then McGreevy, I feel like, is going to come into spring training with every opportunity to take one. Like the Cardinals are going to put it there on the pedestal for him. I think that's what they would like to set spring to be. And then if he performs well enough, he takes it. Well, that's 4 right there between Gray, Fedde, Pallante, and McGreevy. Then you're kind of looking at, all right, if one of the two between Michaelis and Matz is both healthy and still on the roster to begin the season, still in the organization to begin the season, because, again, you're paying them either way, then maybe the Cardinals don't actually have a huge need at starting pitching. Like, that's what's so interesting about the reason I wanted to focus on this Fox Sports article, because it's being written from a national perspective of folks that look at the Cardinals roster and say, well, this is what would make sense for them to go out and get. But we know locally that the Cardinals are maybe going to be a little bit less or a lot bit less aggressive in the way that we expect them to go out and fill some of these holes, because they're saying, yeah, the whole premise here is that we're going to look at internal options, guys that have maybe not had the proven track record just yet, but they also haven't gotten a huge opportunity to deliver on a proven track record. And maybe this is the summer in which we allow some of those players to have that chance for the first time. So as much as I think on paper it makes sense to say, yeah, the Cardinals, probably have needs in the rotation, I also see 6 names that are either being paid or deserve a spot. And sometimes those are not mutually exclusive, because I would say if money were not an object here, you wouldn't necessarily say Michaelis is deserving of a top 5 spot entering the season. Same thing for Steven Matz based on, okay, his durability has been in question. You wouldn't necessarily ride into the campaign with an expectation that Matz is going to give you 30 starts. But between the two of them, maybe it's a case where Matz kind of can open up as a very expensive swing man if you're paying him anyway. And it's not ever really been the production that's been too faulty from Matz. He hasn't been great, but he hasn't been awful when he's pitched. Michaelis was borderline that last season, though, in terms of his numbers, but he also was much more reliable in terms of giving you workload. So would the Cardinals entertain that kind of setup where Michaelis, because they're paying him and he's a good guy for the clubhouse, whatever you might think about Michaelis, they can slot him into a spot to begin spring training at least, and then it could be a case where you might cut ties during the season if you have maybe some other youngsters that emerge during spring. What if Quinn Matthews looks fantastic? What if Tink Hence takes a step? What if a Graceffo, maybe you still have Libby or Zach Thompson under consideration? What if from that group emerge an option or two that you are inclined to give opportunity to, and you maybe want to look at those guys a little bit in this supposed year of development and growth for the team? Then maybe you say, all right, if Matz is being paid, we'll throw him in the bullpen. But if from a competitive standpoint, Michaelis just isn't cutting it, you could at some point, if you still have a healthy Matz, or if you have one of those other young guys emerge, you could maybe make a swap then. I think from a proven track record standpoint and an expectation standpoint, it makes sense that starting pitching is listed as the biggest need for the Cardinals coming into the offseason. I think with the names that we just went through, it's a spot that I would be surprised if the Cardinals pour a lot of effort into. One name that was listed here in this Fox Sports article, or really there were a number of names listed, with the author mentioning that the Cardinals could use a lefty in particular to bolster their rotation. But Blake Snell and Max Fried, 2 names that are being listed, Cardinals aren't going after those guys. They're just not going to be in line to spend on that caliber of arm. Jose Quintana is a name that she lists as well, and that one could be interesting. Again, if you're talking about a 1-year contract for a guy that you already have some familiarity with in the organization, what does that end up costing? That could be something that it wouldn't shock me if the Cardinals went that route, if they're finding ways to move some money around when it comes to Michaelis or Matz. But I don't really anticipate it being that easy. Like, if you want a lefty, Matz just might be your guy. Again, not strictly because you think he's reliable and is going to be a great option there, or even a better caliber option than Quintana, but you are already committed to having to pay the money to Steven Matz, and that could be why the Cardinals decide to retain him. And maybe you get the first fully healthy season from Matz that he will have had during this contract, and you're celebrating that. But it does feel like, although you can make a case from a helicopter view that starting pitching is a need for the Cardinals, I think with the names that we've talked about here, unless they're making a move to take somebody off of that group, like Sonny Gray or Fedde in particular, I just don't know that the Cardinals are going to be overly active. They might bring in a guy that when they sign him, you go, is he a bona fide starter? Is he going to make it above any of the other names? But it could be like a cheap flyer on someone who can genuinely compete for that Michaelis or Matz spot, if that's something that they're looking to have available coming into spring. And if that guy performs better, then maybe the Cardinals say, the money be damned, we're gonna let this guy go, and we're gonna pitch the guy that we think gives us a better chance to win, because that's still something that matters to our fans. And if we're paying, if we're not paying too much for this flyer, whoever they might decide to sign, in a world in which they do make a free agent acquisition, or maybe it happens via trade, then the Cardinals are at least able to sort of ignore the money, because the money is the money. There's nothing you can do about the money if you can't move Michaelis for any sort of relief from that salary. Same thing with Matz. If they go through this offseason and they can't do that, it doesn't mean they won't bring in somebody on, and I'm talking like $5 million or less, but would be interesting to just create some additional competition, unless, of course, they are fully invested in the notion of going in on these young guys that they just haven't really had spots for in recent years. McGreevy is at the top of that list for me, but don't forget about a Graceffo and some of the other guys that have kind of lingered in AAA or have kind of bounced back and forth between the two levels. Number 2 on this list is outfield, and we'll read from the Fox Sports article. She says the Cardinals could use another everyday outfielder to join Brendan Donovan and Lars Nootbaar. Rather than dipping into the market, the still retooling Cardinals appear likely to turn to in-house options for those upgrades. Jordan Walker, Victor Scott have yet to find consistency in the majors. She's right about that. But they could get more runway from the Cardinals to prove they belong. And Michael Ciani also has a lot to prove to earn a potential full-time role. Yeah, I don't see Ciani necessarily as a guy that you're just going to write off completely, but it is interesting the symmetry that a lot of fans have pointed out between him and Victor Scott, who, Victor Scott has the prospect pedigree. Ciani doesn't. He was a waiver claim that has impressed the staff and therefore earned his way into every opportunity he's gotten. Which was a lot down the stretch last year for sure, and he's great defensively. Victor Scott, I think, comes into spring training with every opportunity to be the primary center fielder this next season. But if he still lags behind offensively, if Ciani continues to be that steady drumbeat that the staff is looking for, then it wouldn't shock me if Scott would begin the season in AAA. It wouldn't shock me if both Scott and Ciani are on the roster, but maybe, they split time. It wouldn't stun me if one of the guys ends up being traded. It wouldn't make sense to necessarily trade Victor Scott because he has that prospect pedigree. And if you're still a believer in that, you're waiting to see that emerge on a more significant level at the big leagues for a guy who's still young and has his future in front of him. But I also don't think that they're trying to write off Michael Ciani completely either, especially not when you take the context of they gave him the everyday role in center field down the stretch of a season that was not going to result in the playoffs, and they still played him. So there was likely a lot of reasons behind that, but it is what happened. So as far as outfield, again, this is another spot where you could say, sure, I could see the Cardinals needing an upgrade, but I don't necessarily know that they're going to do it. Here's part of the mix as well. One name that wasn't mentioned was Alec Burleson. I would agree with the characterization that Nootbaar and Donovan are everyday guys. Donovan might not be an everyday outfielder, though. Again, the Arenado thing is still sort of hanging out there off in the distance and is going to impact positionally where some of the Cardinals' in-house options that they're going to lean on and going to turn to might end up playing defensively. Donovan could move to the infield if Arenado is traded. You could see how that swap could materialize, which then is going to open up more corner outfield spots for Burleson on the days that he's not playing first base, since the Cardinals have now committed Wilson Contreras to doing some first base. Nootbaar, I think, is going to be an everyday guy. If he's healthy, he's going to play quite a bit next year as the Cardinals really lean in on, is this somebody we extend? Is this somebody that we plant our flag on for the future? What's that look like? And I think Jordan Walker as well is somebody that you'll see getting a ton of playing time, even if some of that playing time comes at DH. I expect the Cardinals to be ready to push their chips in on Jordan Walker to say, let's just find out, because this was a guy that we've touted as a big-time prospect, and it's been a bumpy road the last couple of years. A lot of reasons behind that, but now it's the opportunity where the pressure It's not to say the pressure's off. It's still big league baseball, but the pressure is not the same to produce a winner in St. Louis this summer as it has been in recent years. So it's going to be a situation where Jordan Walker should be allowed to and permitted to play through some of the growing pains, not only defensively, but offensively as a young player gets acclimated to the big leagues. So Walker as a regular, Nootbaar as a regular, and then between Siani and Scott, you're kind of in that boat for center field. I don't really think the Cardinals are going to go out and get a splash or make a splash for outfield unless it comes in a trade that allows things to look a lot more creative than we're having a vision to see at this point. But the one thing I'll say is it is intriguing center field. You could make a case that it would be nice if they could wave their magic wand and turn either Victor Scott or Michael Siani into a right-handed version of themselves so that you could platoon the two. It's not how it works. I mean, those resources are finite. That player might exist out there in the ether, but right now you have a Siani and a Victor Scott that both hit left-handed, and they both have similar styles of games, with Victor Scott, in my opinion, having the higher upside offensively, and Siani being the more polished player right now defensively. But I think Scott has an upside that matches what Siani is as a center fielder with the glove on. So that's the one area where I would say, like, it would be nice if they had that flexibility, but it also may not be the end of the world for the Cardinals. You're talking about their number 9 batter, more likely than not, somebody to bat down in the order, and have two guys in their 20s that are still trying to emerge and show what they can be at the big league level. So who's to say that Siani can't have an offseason where he improves even more at the plate and shows up and is a more closer to league average offensively? Same thing with Victor Scott. Maybe he could be an above average hitter. And it may be that the Cardinals just aren't too concerned just yet with how that overlaps and the fact that you might not be maximizing a platoon advantage by playing those two guys. It just may be that this is a summer where if they keep them both, you find out really what you have in both. And look, I know there are going to be a lot of people listening that say we already know what Michael Siani is, and it's not a high upside type of player. And look, that's fine if that's your viewpoint. I don't think that's the viewpoint the Cardinals share. They really like Michael Siani. It's kind of a similar vibe with I think the way that the public often looks to Pedro Pages and sees him getting all that opportunity over Herrera this past year. And they say, this guy's not really, we kind of know what he is, but the Cardinals say, well, we really like this player. So if nothing else, it's another year for both of those guys to get, both Siani and Pages, to get some opportunity to really solidify, all right, what's their workup as you get into more and more plate appearances at the big league level? What can we expect from these players over the long haul of their career? The Cardinals might be getting into that mode with both of them, and that may play out for another season, even though I would say a lot in the fan base are skeptical and would already look at it to say, yeah, we kind of already have a feel for where those guys are. This could be another year where the Cardinals still say, yeah, let's give some playing time to Pages. Let's not overly concern ourselves with the fact that we're not gaining an in-game advantage based on right versus left when it comes to Scott and Siani, and we're just going to try to find a way to play both of them. I could be reading the situation totally wrong, but I think spring training is going to be important to both Siani and Scott, as the Cardinals just have to kind of let the chips fall on where they prioritize the playing time this coming season. If Scott earns the spot, I think he'll get the spot. I don't think that he's going to play well and the Cardinals are going to put Siani above him if the play on the field in Grapefruit League doesn't dictate it. I also could see a world in which Siani serves as a bench player behind Victor Scott and can kind of roam the outfield in various spots when you need a defensive replacement late. It could be more of a utility guy, a bench weapon, in a way that I don't think we're ready to look at Victor Scott's career and say that's going to be his ceiling, that's going to be his role. I think the Cardinals, if Scott is ready, I think that they'll want him to get some playing time at the big league level. If he is not quite ready to overtake Siani for the bulk of the playing time, that could be where you do start Victor at center field in Memphis this year and just kind of let him get some more plate appearances under his belt, because his numbers overall were not overwhelmingly good at Memphis. So he may just still need some more seasoning. I think the offseason is going to be huge, and we'll get a chance to hear from him, I'm sure, at winter warmup as to how he's been working to improve in the winter. But that's going to be a part of this for sure that is going to go into dictating where the Cardinals stand with their outfield. The Arenado piece is a big one as to whether or not they trade him. If they don't, I certainly don't think the Cardinals are going to go out and acquire a bunch of outfielders, because I think when you look at the names they've got, you could already make the case that there's a logjam there. So as much as I understand the outside perspective that, yep, you would like more guaranteed production in your outfield, as the author of the Fox Sports article that we're referencing said, the Cardinals seem as though they are going to turn to in-house options to maybe fill some of the perceived vacancies there. And then number 3 on this list was relief pitching. And the note here from the article by Deesha Thosar mentions that the Cardinals are going to be in line to need some high leverage arms, or at least one who can pair with Helsley with Kittredge hitting free agency. Notes David Robertson or Aroldis Chapman could be of some help to St. Louis. I feel like if the Cardinals went that route, it would be on a type of contract where you could perceive the chance to trade away that player at the deadline if necessary. And look, maybe they would want to bring Kittredge back if that's, a guy that they like and the price is right. But I could also see them going in the complete other direction. You not only don't add a high leverage relief arm, but you trade away the best one that you've got in Helsley, either before the season by capitalizing on teams that are looking to build that World Series roster in January or December, or you can say, let's go into the season with Helsley, understanding that if we're a 500 or below team in July, he's going to be a very prominent trade chip that could net us some real prospect capital at that time before the in-season deadline. But I could also see a world in which the Cardinals say, yeah, we do that. We trade him ahead of the season, and guys that we maybe thought were starters, but they're going to come in as, maybe some bullpen options. You're going to really just see from that Kloffenstein and Robertson and maybe even Tekoa Roby and just a number of guys. What do we have in these players, and can any of them be viable big league relievers right now? Ryan Fernandez is going to obviously take on a role, I think, next year. And Jojo Romero, like a team that is not dead set on competing is maybe not overly focused on what does the bullpen look like going into the season. So I could see a world in which the Cardinals don't overly prioritize that, and they just kind of make do with some internal options in that regard too, which maybe not very exciting to say when I said the top 3 options in terms of areas that they need to improve, according to one national writer's perspective, are areas the Cardinals may not go out and get anybody. I could understand some frustration from that if you're a Cardinals fan, because we're basically telling you before the offseason even gets into full swing, the areas of need for the Cardinals might not end up being areas that the Cardinals ultimately decide to prioritize in the offseason. But I have been talking a lot about believing that a pivot to internal options and to at least giving some of those guys opportunities rather than finding that, 3 years down the road, they're actually pretty decent MLB players, but they have to learn that with another organization because the Cardinals didn't give them the opportunity while they were here. Like, that might not be the worst thing in the world for the Cardinals. It is counter to the way that they have approached things in recent years. And in fairness, we have done a lot of collective complaining about the way that they've approached those matters over the past however many years. So to think that they might be going in a different direction this time, I don't know if it's the worst thing in the world. And we're going to have to let it play out. And I'm understanding that it's going to be probably a frustrating process. It's easy right now to be kind of enamored by the idea of what they're looking to do because we haven't really seen it in recent years. To say, oh, yeah, they're going to look at some of the younger players and we get a glimpse at the future. But like, there's also the world in which the future and some of these unproven players haven't proven it because they may never be fully capable of proving it. Like, it's a nice theory to say, oh, the problem with the Cardinals has been they haven't leaned in enough on some of the younger players and given opportunities to those guys. But maybe this current crop of young players is one that we'll look back on in a few years and say, yeah, it was a bunch of guys who maybe had more hype to them than there should have been. Like, it could go in that direction as well. I don't anticipate that it will. I think you'll have some good with the bad. There will be some names that you were hopeful about that don't end up panning out, but there will also be some names that maybe you kind of wrote off and said, I have an idea of what this guy already is, and he turns into a fixture for the Cardinals during not only 2025, where the team may not be especially competitive, or at least is not prioritizing what that looks like on the field and in the NL Central standings, but they could get to a point where those guys can contribute down the road in years where the Cardinals do say, yeah, we're doing everything we can to win, and keeping players like this, that, and the other, whoever it might be, around for that endeavor is going to be a prosperous type of event. So we'll see. I think patience is going to be a virtue when it comes to all of this for Cardinals fans. And like I said, I understand that that's going to be frustrating because they've been telling you for a while to be patient, and you didn't really get rewarded in that first go around. And now it feels like they're starting something brand new, and there hasn't really been that full referendum on like, well, what about the patience that was being preached in previous years? There was no payoff for that ultimately. And look, I think there are going to be fans that do check out of this process because they're going to see the record. And if it's not up to par for a third year in a row, or the par that the organization had previously established, then yeah, I think attendance is going to be a very interesting topic of conversation again this year. That's probably not unique to the Cardinals, though. I think just in the economy in general, it's more difficult to get fans and families and folks down to the ballpark when you encompass everything that goes into it. So I'm also understanding of some of the challenges that are faced at this point in time just in life, not really even about the Cardinals specifically, but the Cardinals, like in that environment, it is going to be incumbent upon the Cardinals to put forth a product that folks are really excited about. And I think leaning in on young players could be a jackpot type of move, because what if a Gorman or a Jordan Walker or a Lars Nootbaar or, whoever else, Victor Scott, obviously you could talk about Mason Wynn. What if these guys become the next core and there aren't as many changes needed for what ends up being a more minor facelift to get the Cardinals back on the right track? Then suddenly I think the fans are going to buy back in. But it always does come down to pitching, doesn't it? Like, I think on the position player side, you've seen production that has not been quite up to par from the young guys, but now they're going to hopefully spread their wings a little bit more and play loose, play free, and know that their job is not maybe on the line with every 0 for 4 that they go through. That can be a very empowering thing for a player, but it does always come down to pitching. So we'll see if the Cardinals have enough on that side of things, because, again, this Fox Sports article that we've been referencing, starting pitching was the top of the list. You might have 6 or 7 names that you could name off the top of your head that, as of now, are on the roster and could contribute to the pitching. But by the same token, are those going to be the level of quality names that get the Cardinals back to a playoff berth sooner rather than later? It's difficult to say at this point in time. And on paper, you could make a case that, no, there's not a lot of reason to believe that it will be that way. So that'll be, I think, the area of the team that has to maybe overperform expectations the most to be able to allow for a seamless transition here, where the Cardinals lean more on internal options, but maybe don't take a huge step back in the standings. If it's going to play out that way, it's going to be because the pitching, I think, overperforms expectations. Because I still feel like even with underperforming offensive numbers the last couple of years, you still have a lot of faith that the players that are sort of making up the core of this young core can at least produce at a major league average level. And if that should come to pass, then the Cardinals might be okay on that side of the ball. What will the pitching look like does end up being a fair question, and that's why when you see starting pitching and relief pitching listed as 2 of the top 3 needs in the offseason, and if the Cardinals aren't really overly prioritizing addressing those needs, then that's where you kind of say, yeah, they're letting the chips fall where they may, and that could result in a tough going type of season for the Cardinals unless some of those guys hit home. So we'll see what ends up happening. We'll continue to break it all down throughout the offseason, and we'll talk in our next episode again about the non-tender news, which is going to be out by the time you're listening to this podcast, I reckon. But I appreciate you guys for listening as always and for joining me on the channel. Make sure you're subscribed. If you'd like to support the channel in any additional measure, check out the membership down below. That link is in the description to the video as well. Thank you guys so much, and we'll talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.